In earlier lectures, we explored the origins of the Renaissance in Italy, tracing its beginnings and development. In this lesson, we will examine the birth of humanism, particularly what has been termed civic humanism. We will analyze specific aspects of the Renaissance and the humanist movement as they unfolded in the Italian city-states. The Renaissance has often been described by scholars as a period marked by the rebirth of classical antiquity, characterized by a renewed interest in and celebration of the ideals of the ancient world, particularly in art, literature, philosophy, and politics. This perception stems from the belief that these classical ideals had been largely obscured or diminished during the Middle Ages, and only began to re-emerge in the consciousness of Italian scholars and thinkers in the 14th century. Humanism was arguably the most crucial intellectual development underpinning the Renaissance as a cultural and historical phenomenon. This movement represented a profound transformation in the study and interpretation of classical antiquity, prompting a renewed engagement with the works of ancient Greek and Roman authors. While scholars had long studied these texts, the Renaissance marked a shift from merely imitating classical style and language to actively seeking the wisdom, ethical principles, and knowledge contained within them. During the Renaissance, there was a growing demand for a more comprehensive education than what had been available during the Middle Ages, where scholarly pursuits were largely confined to the fields of medicine, law, or theology. To address this need, a new educational curriculum was developed, one that emphasized the study of classical authors and subjects such as grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy. This program of study became known as the Studia Humanitatis, a term that emerged around the 15th century, and those who advocated for and participated in this new form of learning were known as humanists. Humanism in the Renaissance was not merely an academic movement, it was a worldview that sought to reconcile Christian beliefs with the intellectual traditions of the ancient world. Renaissance humanists maintained their faith in Christianity and the existence of God, but they also embraced the secular wisdom of antiquity, recognizing the value of classical knowledge in understanding human experience and the world around them. This dual acceptance led to a growing interest in diverse fields such as art, literature, history, and moral philosophy. Unlike the medieval period, which was characterized by a predominant focus on the divine and the eternal, Renaissance humanism emphasized the importance of the earthly and the individual. This shift did not imply a rejection of religious faith. Rather, it reflected a broader intellectual curiosity about the human condition and a desire to explore the full range of human potential. Renaissance thinkers and artists began to celebrate the dignity of man, seeing humanity as capable of great achievements, not only in preparation for the afterlife, but also within the confines of the present world. The humanist emphasis on earthly existence over spiritual preparation for paradise was not a denial of the divine. Instead, it represented a more balanced view that valued human experience in both its spiritual and worldly dimensions. This approach encouraged a deeper engagement with the arts, sciences, and humanities, which were seen as essential to understanding and improving the human condition. Humanism fostered a spirit of inquiry and innovation, driving advancements in a wide array of disciplines, from literature and art to science and philosophy. It encouraged individuals to seek knowledge beyond the confines of established religious doctrine, promoting a more secular perspective that recognized the worth of human experience, creativity, and reason. In doing so, humanism laid the groundwork for the intellectual and cultural achievements that would define the Renaissance, fundamentally altering the course of Western thought and society. The question of when the Renaissance began remains a topic of significant debate among historians and cultural scholars. At the heart of Renaissance humanism was the idea that individuals should become deeply engaged with the classical past, using Roman literature not merely as an object of study, but as a source of answers to contemporary problems. Rome became a central hub for this new intellectual movement, as people yearned for a revival, a renaissance of Rome's former greatness. Interestingly, the demand for a better understanding of antiquity first emerged within the field of law. Legal scholars began to look back to ancient Roman statutes, revisiting the original texts rather than relying on the interpretations and notes of medieval commentators. This critical approach led to a heightened interest in classical works more broadly. In the Italian cities of Padua and Verona, discussions among jurists sparked a renewed search for ancient manuscripts in libraries, highlighting a growing fascination with original classical sources. Despite these developments, historians continue to debate the precise origins of the Renaissance. It remains difficult to pinpoint a single year or place where this monumental cultural and intellectual movement began. The Renaissance is considered a vast, multifaceted period in cultural history, a complex phenomenon encompassing numerous fields such as art, literature, politics, science, and philosophy. Due to this complexity, scholars have found it challenging to agree on a specific date or location that definitively marks the beginning of the Renaissance. However, one cannot discuss the Renaissance's inception without mentioning the German-American historian Hans Baron, formerly a professor at the University of Chicago. Baron's work, particularly his influential book, The Crisis of the Early Italian Renaissance, Civic Humanism and Republican Liberty in an Age of Classicism and Tyranny, published in 1955, offers a provocative perspective on this topic. Baron argued that Florentine republicanism represented a happy marriage between the civic traditions of the medieval commune and the humanist ideals championed by Petrarch alongside classical scholarship. According to Baron's somewhat controversial view, the birth of the Renaissance can indeed be traced to a specific place and period, Florence, between the years 1380 and 1402. During these decades, both Republican and humanist ideas began to emerge among Florentine intellectuals as a response to the protracted diplomatic and military conflict between Florence and Milan. Baron contended that this unique historical moment, characterized by intense political rivalry and the struggle for Republican liberty, created the conditions necessary for the fusion of classical learning with civic engagement, a hallmark of Renaissance humanism. Baron's theory emphasizes the idea that the Renaissance was not simply a revival of ancient knowledge, but a dynamic reconfiguration of classical ideals within the context of contemporary political and social challenges. The Florentine scholars, according to Baron, drew on classical models of republicanism, particularly from ancient Rome, to articulate and defend the values of civic participation, public virtue, and political liberty. This fusion of classical learning with active civic life became the cornerstone of what Baron termed civic humanism, a defining feature of the early Renaissance. Civic humanism, as a historical and ideological concept, can be understood as a political discourse deeply rooted in the language and ideas of classical antiquity. It draws upon the political theories of Aristotle, the traditions of the Roman Republic, and the political experiences of the Italian city-states, or communi. This form of humanism is most closely associated with the Cambridge School of Intellectual History, notably represented by scholars such as John Pocock and Quentin Skinner, who emphasize the importance of historical context and linguistic analysis in understanding political thought. According to Hans Baron, a severe political and existential crisis occurred in Florence between the years 1380 and 1402, which played a pivotal role in the emergence of civic humanism. During these years, Florence faced the existential threat of conquest by the powerful city-state of Milan, which was aggressively seeking to establish a dominant empire in northern Italy. Under the leadership of the ambitious and autocratic ruler Gian Galeazzo Visconti, Milan nearly succeeded in this endeavor, with Florence standing as one of the last significant holdouts against Milanese expansion. Florence, under siege and isolated, was on the brink of capitulation when an unexpected turn of events occurred. In 1402, Gian Galeazzo Visconti, who had led the campaign against Florence, succumbed to the plague just outside the city walls. His sudden death created a power vacuum and internal disarray within Milan, compelling the Milanese forces to withdraw and effectively lifting the siege of Florence. This unforeseen development was seen by Florentines as an act of providence that saved their city from certain domination. Baron argued that this period of intense crisis in Florence gave rise to a new form of humanism, Civic humanism, rooted in the ideals of republican liberty and public virtue. Faced with the threat of external domination and internal collapse, Florentine intellectuals turned to the works of classical antiquity, especially those of ancient Rome and Greece, to articulate a vision of civic life centered on active political participation, communal responsibility, and the defense of republican values. Drawing inspiration from the republican traditions of Rome and the political theories of Aristotle, Florentine humanists sought to create a political ideology that emphasized the importance of citizen engagement in public affairs, the value of collective decision-making, and the necessity of preserving the autonomy and liberty of the city-state. This ideological movement was characterized by a revival of classical rhetoric and philosophy, which was adapted to serve the needs of the contemporary Florentine Republic. The concept of civic humanism has been further developed and analyzed by members of the Cambridge School, particularly John Pocock and Quentin Skinner. Their approach emphasizes the historical context in which political ideas are developed and the ways in which these ideas are articulated and utilized in specific historical moments. For scholars like Pocock and Skinner, civic humanism represents a critical engagement with the classical tradition, one that reflects the specific political and social realities of Renaissance Florence. Pocock and Skinner argue that Florentine civic humanism was not merely a revival of classical ideas, but also a creative adaptation of these ideas to address contemporary political challenges. In this view, civic humanism served as a means of legitimizing the Republic's resistance to external tyranny and as a framework for promoting active citizenship, civic virtue, and communal solidarity in a time of crisis. Florence's leading scholars perceived the Milanese threat as the most severe crisis in the city's history, realizing just how close Florence had come to being conquered. Among these scholars were Coluccio Salutati, who lived from 1331 to 1406, and his pupil, Leonardo Bruni, who lived from 1374 to 1444. They played a crucial role in articulating and defending the city's republican ideals during this period of existential peril. Coluccio Salutati, a prominent humanist and chancellor of Florence, used his position to remind the Florentines of their city's historical legacy. He famously characterized Florence as the daughter of Rome and a bastion of justice and equality. For Salutati, Florence was not merely a political entity, but a living symbol of the ancient Roman ideals of republicanism and civic virtue. His rhetoric served to galvanize the city's population, fostering a sense of pride and collective identity centered around the idea that Florence was the rightful heir to the Roman tradition of liberty and self-governance. Salutati's intellectual legacy was continued and expanded upon by his student, Leonardo Bruni, who was also an esteemed public official and chancellor of Florence. In his celebrated work, Historiarum Florentini Populi Libri Duodecim, 12 books on the history of the Florentine people, Bruni developed a more elaborate historical narrative that underscored Florence's deep-seated commitment to freedom and self-rule. He argued that even before the founding of Rome, the Etruscans had established free cities in Tuscany, embedding the love of liberty deep within the cultural and historical consciousness of the Florentine people. According to Bruni, the desire for freedom was not merely a consequence of Roman influence but an inherent characteristic passed down from the Etruscan forebears, predating even the rise of Rome. Bruni's work epitomized the principles of civic humanism by positioning Florence as a city that drew its strength and identity from classical antiquity. By rooting Florence's claim to liberty in a lineage that extended back to the ancient Etruscans and beyond the Roman Republic, Bruni sought to establish a unique and continuous tradition of freedom that justified Florence's political and cultural independence. This narrative served both as a source of local pride and as a moral justification for resistance against external domination, especially by the forces of Milan. Moreover, Bruni and Salutati, through their scholarship, promoted a vision of civic humanism that celebrated active citizenship and communal involvement in the governance of the city. They advanced the idea that the Florentine Republic was a direct inheritor of classical ideals, which required the active participation of its citizens in public life. By invoking the past glory of Rome and the republican virtues of the ancient world, They aimed to inspire contemporary Florentines to uphold the values of civic freedom and to resist tyranny in all its forms. The contributions of Salutati and Bruni were significant not only for the intellectual life of Florence, but also for the broader development of Renaissance humanism. Their writings articulated a model of civic virtue and republican liberty that would influence subsequent generations of thinkers and political leaders. Salutati's and Bruni's emphasis on the continuity of civic freedom from the Etruscan to the Roman and Florentine eras helped to shape the ideological foundation of Renaissance political thought. Their efforts to frame Florence's contemporary struggles within the context of a venerable historical tradition helped to forge a sense of collective identity and purpose. This sense of identity was crucial for Florence during its confrontations with external threats, particularly during the conflict with Milan. By establishing a connection between Florence's present and its imagined classical past, Salutati and Bruni created a powerful narrative that underscored the city's resilience, autonomy, and commitment to the republican ideals of liberty and justice. Both Coluccio Salutati and Leonardo Bruni closely examined the reasons behind Florence's narrow escape from what they viewed as an imminent disaster during the Milanese siege. Their analysis led to a significant and innovative conclusion. The crisis was, in part, the result of deficiencies in the existing educational system. They argued that a new system was required, one that would prepare future leaders and citizens to withstand such threats more effectively. This system would need to cultivate responsible leaders and engage citizens who were capable of navigating and mitigating crises of this magnitude. This new approach to education, which they termed humanism, was grounded in the study of classical authors from ancient Rome and Greece. According to Hans Baron, who has extensively analyzed this intellectual movement, the key classical authors, particularly Aristotle and Cicero, advocated for a system based on republican and constitutional values. Baron suggests that for the Renaissance humanists, such texts provided a rich source of political wisdom and guidance for constructing a society resilient to tyranny and capable of self-governance. Bruni and his contemporaries promoted a vision of humanism that sought political answers and solutions in the writings of classical authors. Their objective was to revive the grandeur of Rome and emulate its dominant role in shaping civic life and governance. Renaissance humanists, therefore, reintroduced the ancient Roman concept of political participation, which held that all citizens should be involved in public affairs as an essential aspect of their personal and collective development. For the humanists, political participation was not merely a right, but a fundamental duty integral to the human experience. This participation was to be realized through dialogue and debate, seen as the primary means by which individuals could develop their capacities for reasoning and moral judgment. Engaging in dialogue enabled citizens to learn from one another, fostering a community of enlightened and virtuous individuals. Thus, this form of education was not only beneficial for individual development, but also for the city and society as a whole, as it cultivated capable and ethical citizens and leaders. The humanist educational framework proposed by Bruni and others aimed to create an environment where political engagement was seen as both necessary and virtuous. The revival of classical learning was not an exercise in antiquarianism. Rather, it was a deliberate effort to draw upon the wisdom of the past to address contemporary challenges. By studying classical texts, humanists believed they could find the intellectual tools to construct a civic culture that would ensure stability, justice, and prosperity. Central to this vision was the idea that active participation in civic life was essential for the flourishing of both the individual and the community. Through participation, citizens would not only exercise their rights, but also fulfill their potential as rational and moral beings. The dialogues and debates promoted by this educational model were designed to foster a spirit of inquiry and critical thinking, qualities deemed essential for informed and responsible governance. The humanist emphasis on education through the study of classical texts reflected a broader philosophical commitment to the idea that human beings were capable of self-improvement and moral development. This commitment was grounded in the belief that by engaging with the works of ancient philosophers, historians, and orators, citizens could cultivate the virtues necessary for personal fulfillment and the effective governance of their communities. In this sense, humanist education aimed to produce not only knowledgeable individuals, but also virtuous citizens who could contribute positively to the common good. It was believed that an educated citizenry would create a more just and prosperous society by promoting ethical governance and civic responsibility. With these reflections, we conclude our discussion for today. In the forthcoming session, we will delve deeper into the specifics of humanistic education. As previously noted, the humanists emphasized that political debate and engagement were integral components of one's education. According to humanist thought, it was essential for a citizen to be well-versed in moral philosophy and rhetoric. These disciplines were considered crucial aspects of a humanistic education, equipping individuals with the intellectual tools necessary to navigate complex and challenging decisions. The humanist perspective held that through rigorous training in these fields, individuals could develop the judgment and eloquence required for effective participation in public life. This educational approach was designed to foster not only the capacity for critical thinking, but also the moral and rhetorical skills necessary for making informed and ethical choices in the realm of politics and beyond. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to our next exploration into the nuances of humanistic learning.